Well, welcome back, friends. It's good to have you here. It's good to be here with you. And, I'm just going to jump right into this today. We started a new series last week in our first time back after the holidays. And we're entering into this study of prayer and worship and developing an awareness of God. And I'm going to start out by saying this today. I think that prayer, if we just look at the activity of prayer, I want you to think about it today as being about God becoming bigger in our lives. That may be a funny way of saying it, but I want you to think about it today. God becoming bigger in our lives, as if the creator God of the universe could ever become any greater or any bigger than what he already is. Stay with me for a few minutes on this. At my age, I've had more than my fair share of embarrassing moments. And I'm not going to bore you today with the litany of ways that I have made a fool of myself over the course of my life. I'm sure you have also. I want to think more a little bit about a different angle on embarrassment today. There are polls after polls, surveys that are given that tell us that the number one fear that people have is the fear of public speaking. That isn't my biggest fear, although I'll tell you it was when I was younger. Public speaking, of all things. The number two fear, death. If you ask me, those things are just not in the right order at all. But the truth of the matter is that most people would rather die than speak in public. Why? I think it gets all the way back to this idea of the fear that we have of looking foolish. The fear that we have of looking foolish. This fear that we have, this self-consciousness that most every one of us have, it's that thing that keeps us from raising our hand to ask a question in the fourth grade. It's this fear of looking stupid. I know that's a bad word, but that's kind of what we are raised with when we are young. It's the fear that we have of asking the pretty girl out for a date when I was 15 years old. Is because I was afraid she would say no and that I would be so embarrassed. So I'd rather just not do it at all. And that's why it took me nearly 8 months. 8 months to make any kind of action towards Wanda when we were 15 years old. Oh gosh, I'm getting embarrassed thinking about it again. This fear, this self-consciousness that we have, this fear of embarrassment, is what keeps us from changing majors in school or changing jobs later in life. It's the fear that we have of inviting somebody to church or talking to them about Jesus. And we have this fear that overwhelms us that somehow we are going to get embarrassed in this process. I wonder sometimes how many marriages could have been saved from tons of grief if they would have only asked for some help when they first faced the problems, but they were simply too embarrassed to ask for it. I think deep down it's the fear of foolishness that keeps us from praying for a miracle or asking another person for help. It's the fear of foolishness that keeps us from worshiping God the way that we could and should. It's fear of somebody seeing us, questioning us, and us not having an adequate answer. But here's the deal. If you aren't willing to look foolish, you are foolish. Remember what we were told when we first started school? That there are no foolish questions. I think even when we started school in our little pea brains, we said, oh yeah, there are foolish questions. Because I've seen kids get laughed at when they raise their hand and ask. So I'm not taking that risk. So for today, here's a definition of faith that I think we can work with. The willingness to look foolish. Now, I know there's more to faith than that. But in this moment, in kind of what I'm talking about today, hang with me on it. You know, I can't even imagine how foolish Noah looked when he was building a boat out in the middle of the desert. Or what about Sarah looking foolish going out and shopping for maternity clothes when she was 90 years old? What about the Israelites looking foolish, marching around Jericho, blowing a bunch of trumpets, trying to get the walls to come down? How foolish David must have looked to everybody, not just his own brothers, but everybody, when he pulled out a slingshot to take on Goliath in battle. I have no doubt that the wise men looked anything but wise as they were wandering around following the yonder star. How foolish did you think Peter looked when he stepped out of the boat to walk on water following the example of Jesus? And how foolish did Jesus look hanging naked on the cross? But that's faith. Faith oftentimes is the willingness to look foolish. And the results speak for themselves, don't they? Noah and his family were saved from the flood. Sarah gave birth to Isaac. The walls of Jericho came tumbling down, and David defeated Goliath. The wise men found the Messiah. Peter actually did walk on water. And Jesus rose from the dead. Can I tell you why I think that none of us is a little harsh? Can I tell you why some of us have never slayed a giant or walked on water? I think on some level it's because we were not willing to risk looking foolish. An attack with a slingshot, or get out of a boat in the middle of a lake. There's another story in the Bible that I think gives us a little bit of insight into all of this. It's the story of Adam and Eve at the beginning of our Bible, right after they had sinned for the first time. In this history-altering moment, something major changed for all time. Yeah, they had disobeyed God's instruction, and they had eaten from the tree that they were forbidden to eat from. And when that happened, it all came crashing in on them. And their response to that was to hide, to run, to get covered up. And in that moment, their awareness of the presence of God became completely skewed. Oh yeah, their eyes were opened wide, but I think in the wrong way. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 7, we read these words, "Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves." You see, the moment that they sinned, they became self-conscious and less God-conscious. It became about them. They became consumed with themselves. And even now, I think you and I are stuck with the fallout of that internal conflict that they started and has been rolling ever since. And unfortunately, most of the time, maybe all of the time, we come to be absorbed by our own stories, our own dramas, our own narratives. It is so like us to be wrapped up in preserving our own reputations, our own self-images that have been carefully crafted in our own minds and in our behaviors. I think because of sin, we are prone to thinking way too much about what other people think of us. Staying smart in our own little comfort zones. Unwilling to risk living by faith, even if that's what God is calling us to, because we fear the response. The Apostle Paul said it this way. Thousands of years after that drama unfolded in the creation narrative, Paul talked about how he had learned to spend his life. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4 says, and this is Paul writing this, "As followers of Christ, we speak as those approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. We are not trying to please people, but God, who tests our hearts." How great would it be if we could be people like that, who lived not trying to please other people, not being so consumed with what others thought about us, that we could live to please God. And check this out. In the Gospel of John, the third chapter, the 30th verse, there's this great line that is given to us by John the Baptist. Now remember, John the Baptist was set apart at his birth. At the same time, Jesus was set apart at his birth. And yet John's job was to point others to Jesus. And in the third chapter, the 30th verse, he writes these really simple words. He must become greater, meaning Jesus. Jesus must become greater. I must become less. And there we see the example for all of us. These are the words of John the Baptist, the one who was sent to prepare the way for Jesus to come into the world. And he says, I must become less so that he can become greater. Gosh, how refreshing, how empowering. What an amazing way to live, to be able to say, I live for him. I am most concerned about what Jesus thinks. So let me wrap up by asking you this question today. Are you ready to care more about what God thinks and care less about what people think? Or to make it even more personal, are you ready to move out of the way a little, to give the presence of God room to move in your life? I think that decision is way more in our hands than we've ever been led to believe. Think about it. As we join together today in sharing the Lord's Supper, his death on the cross and his resurrection from the dead is where we see and where we experience his life-changing greatness in our lives, and what we remember in the bread and the juice of his life given for us. Till next time, see ya.
Your love is like radiant diamonds bursting inside us, we cannot contain. Your love will surely come find us like blazing wildfire, singing your name. God of mercy,